always thinking about this every single time, and we exhaust ourselves over this process. And that's how we're enabling ourselves in this illusion of unworthiness. I'll share with you an old joke. This is about a Jewish mother who sends a telegram to her son. Now, I know some of you here are very young, and you probably are born after, the telegram has come and gone. I've never really seen a telegram either. But usually as you type something and then from a machine, it gets sent to another machine and the message goes to the person. So am I right? For those who knows? Okay. So usually the messages would be like this, right? Something, 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 stop. Something, 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 stop. And it continues. So this is an old joke that the Jewish mother sent a telegram to her son. She said in this telegram, start worrying, stop. Details to follow, stop. So it's funny, because as soon as we say, start worrying, all these thoughts will come into our heads. But there's no details. You don't need to start, I don't need to give you any details. I'll just say, start worrying. And it'll happen by itself automatically. Because we actually live in a free-floating state of anxiety. We don't even need a problem to set off a stream of disaster scenarios, right? Yeah, we go through that very easily. Sometimes, experiences when you're on a plane and you're flying and you go through terrible turbulence. Terrible turbulence. And immediately, without anyone telling you, the plane's not going to crash or anything, but in your mind, you're thinking of the worst case scenario. I have an experience, actually. We were going to India for an Earth Charter conference. A colleague of mine and I were on the plane, and we were flying over Japan. And there was a hurricane. And of course, fantastic turbulence. And the two of us, the experience we went through were very different. She immediately going through the turbulence, we're thinking the plane's gonna crash. Start chanting the mantra, getting ready to die. But I went through something else different. I was going, woohoo, roller coaster. I like roller coaster rides. So I thought it was like a roller coaster. It was totally cool. I didn't think the plane was going to crash because it was a huge plane. I doubt that was going to happen. So very different ways of looking at this, but it takes nothing for us to trigger that disaster scenarios. So living in the future actually creates the illusion that we're managing our lives. And it steels us against personal failure. We keep busy. Staying occupied is a socially sanctioned way of remaining distant from our pain. And this is very true because that's what I came to realize. I kept myself very busy, but in truth, I was running away from my own pain. If we stop, we run into the risk of plunging into that unbearable feeling that we are alone and we're utterly worthless. So we scramble to fill ourselves, our time, our body, our mind. We might go out and buy something new, or we lose ourselves in mindless small talk. As soon as we have a gap, especially now we have, smartphones and iPads and stuff, we go online and we check our email, we do tweets, and we go on Facebook, or we turn on the music, we get a snack, we watch television. Anything to help us bury the feelings of this vulnerability and deficiency that is actually lurking deep down in our psyche. We become our own worst critiques. The running commentary in our mind reminds us over and over that we always screw up, that others are managing their lives so much more efficiently and so much more successfully. So often, we actually end up taking over what our parents left off, pointedly reminding ourselves of our own flaws. We continue this within our own minds. We continue this conversation within our own minds. We focus on other people's faults. The more inadequate we feel, the more uncomfortable it is to admit to our faults. Blaming others actually temporarily relieves us from the weight of failure. The painful truth is that all these strategies that I've just spoken about simply reinforces these insecurities that sustain this illusion of unworthiness, that we're continuing in this vicious cycle of this illusion of our unworthiness. So the more anxiously we tell ourselves stories about how we might fail, about what's wrong with us or with others, the more we actually deepen these grooves, the neural pathways, as those who might have studied biology. Every time you learn something, every time you have a thought, a new neural pathway is formed in your mind, in your brains. So we actually reinforce that. We grow more neural pathways that generate feelings of deficiency. So every time we hide a defect, we actually reinforce this fear that we are insufficient. So when we strive to impress or outdo others, we actually strengthen the underlying belief that we are not good enough as we are. But this doesn't mean that we cannot compete in a healthy way, put wholehearted effort into work, or acknowledge and take pleasure in our own competence. It does not mean that. But when our efforts are driven by fear, the fear that we are flawed, we actually deepen the illusion of unworthiness. So for us to be mindful of this process, what is our intention? What is our motivation? Is it driven by this fear, or is it healthy? And also, when you have, the greater the fear we have, the more intense our hostility. Our enemy becomes the parent who never really respected us, the boss who is preventing us from being successful, a political group that is taking away our power, or a nation that threatens our life. So this us versus them world, the unworthiness, the evil, is out there. Whether it's a family schism or a generations-long war between ethnic groups, creating an enemy imparts a sense of control. You think that is control because we feel superior. We feel right. We believe we are doing something about the problem. Notice I keep emphasizing we, or our, or I, or my. If you look at this, we're actually engaging in the vicious cycle of self-deception. When you're directing anger at an enemy, or we would say demonizing them, it temporarily reduces our feelings of fear and vulnerability because you're directing this energy at something else. But this is not to say that real threats don't exist. They do. We can be a danger to ourselves. Others can harm us. Yet, if we lash out with hatred and violence, if we make war on ourselves or each other, we actually end up generating more fear, more reactivity, and more suffering. So freeing ourselves from this illusion of fear and alienation becomes possible only when we respond to our vulnerability with a wise heart. So this roots of illusion, because we take ourselves as a separate self. That's why we created this illusion. So the Buddha had actually taught that going to the root of our suffering and seeing it clearly was the beginning of freedom. This was his first noble truth. Suffering or discontent is universal, and freeing and fully recognizing its existence is the first step on the path of awakening. I'll repeat this again. Suffering or discontent is universal, and fully recognizing its existence is the first step on the path of awakening. During his all-night vigil, the Buddha looked deeply into his own suffering, and his amazing insight was that all suffering and dissatisfaction arises from a mistaken understanding that we are a separate and distinct self. This perception of, I would say, selfness imprisons us in an endless round of craving and aversion. So when our sense of being is confined in this way, we have forgotten the loving kindness or the loving awareness that is our essence, that connects us with all of life. That what we experience as the self is an aggregate of familiar thoughts, emotions, and patterns of behavior. The mind binds us together, all of these together, and it creates a story about a personal, individual entity that has continuity through time. That's why we were saying in our minds, we were creating our own stories. That was personal. Everything we experience is subsumed into this story of self, and it becomes my experience. I am afraid. This is my desire. This habit of attaching a sense of self to our experience is what I would say the I-ing and the my-ing. We interpret everything we think and feel, and everything that happens to us as in some way belonging or created or caused by self. So our most habitual and compelling feelings and thoughts actually define the core of who we think we are. If we're caught in the illusion of unworthiness, we experience that core as flawed. When we take life personally by I-ing and me-ing, the universal sense that something is wrong very easily solidifies into something is wrong with me. When I look into my own feelings of unworthiness, sometimes I can't point to a significant way I'm actually falling short. I can't. I just feel unworthy, but I don't know exactly where I'm unworthy. Yet this feeling of being self, of being separate from others, brings up a fundamental assumption that I am not okay. So our grasping and aversion play out through a dauntingly complex array of physical, mental, emotional activities. Many of them actually are outside of our awareness. We're not aware, but it's constantly in play in our minds. Wanting and fearing are natural energies. They're part of actually evolution's designed to protect us and to help us survive and thrive. But when wanting and fearing becomes the core of our identity, we lose sight of the fullness of our being. We become identified with, at best, only a sliver of our natural being. We only become identified to this wanting and this fearing. We become identified at best with our, of this wanting and this fearing. So the sliver that actually perceives itself as incomplete, it is at risk, and it is separate from the rest of the world. This wanting and this fearing is what it creates us. But if our sense of who we are is defined by feelings of neediness and insecurity, we forget that we're also curious, that we're humorous, and we're actually caring. We forget about the breath that is nourishing us and the love that unites it and unites us, the enormous beauty and the fragility that is our shared experience in being alive. We forget about all of those, and we became very engrossed in the fear and the wanting, the neediness and the aversion. But we're not that. We're more than that. We have a lot of good qualities that we forget to identify ourselves with. So how do we go about without anxiety with our own imperfections? When I share these stories with them, many people have told me that when they are finally able to see how long their life has been imprisoned by self-hatred and shame, they feel not only grief, but also a sense of life-giving hope. It's like waking up from a bad dream. When we see our prison, we can also see our potential. I'll quote from the renowned 7th century Chan master, Sheng. He taught that true freedom is actually being without anxiety about imperfection. That is true freedom. Being without anxiety about imperfection. This means accepting our human existence and all of life as it is. Imperfection is not our personal problem.